Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on child well-being in the digital age. We're really pleased to have such a great turnout of attendees. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people joining us from the four corners of the globe, and I believe every continent except Antarctica. Very happy to be with you today and very happy to be discussing this important topic. The COVID-19 pandemic really reminded us that schools are not just places of academic learning, and they're really part of the social fabric of our communities. And children, schools and teachers are increasingly called on to support the physical, social, and emotional health and well-being of children. But there's a real question of how we do this effectively. And here at the OECD, we have a number of different work streams that speak to this, and we're really delighted today to bring to you a conversation between different parts of the house. I am your master of ceremonies. I'll be sort of behind the scenes and handling the question and answer at the end. Please do use the chat function to already be posing any questions you might have. We will be collecting them throughout the session and using them towards the end. And to start us off, I will pass the torch to our Deputy Secretary General Ulrik Knudsen to open the session, please.
Welcome, participants, colleagues, panelists, and moderators. We're actually two moderators here today. And Tracy, even if Antarctica may not be listening in today, it is a pleasure to open this webinar on child well-being in the digital age. And it's also really a pleasure to be joined from colleagues across the OECD. This is really a holistic, multidisciplinary project. We have colleagues from the Directorates for Education and Skills, from STI, Science, Technology and Innovation, from Employment, Labor and Social Affairs, and also from our brand new Center on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity, also abbreviated as WISE. We're all here today because the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the inequalities facing children, not only in their home lives, but also at school. In the digital domain, schools and systems have struggled to provide adequate digital access and skills for children to enable them to transition to digital learning. This is, needless to say, a crucial problem because digital skills and access are essential really on so many fronts, not only for the continuity of learning, of course, but also for social interactions, including providing opportunities for children to play and socialize in the current context. Yet, despite no doubt immense efforts, digital inequalities persist also across OECD countries. Many children, even in the most advanced economies, lack adequate access to digital tools and platforms. Many more lack the skills to effectively leverage digital tools for their educational, personal and social needs. These inequalities are further compounded when their parents or their guardians lack adequate skills to effectively guide their children in the digital environment, and perhaps even more importantly, also help them keep safe from risks. Over the last few years, risks such as cyberbullying or exposure to harmful content online have gained in prominence. A number of new risks have also emerged, such as fake news or conduct risks, where children's own behavior actually can make them vulnerable. The OECD is about to release a publication that reviews these risks and is currently revising its council recommendation on the protection of children online. The aim is to find a balance in addressing the opportunities and risks that children can encounter in the digital environment and assist governments in setting the conditions for a safe and beneficial digital environment for children, promoting cohesion in legal responses and good international cooperation. It is, however, important to underline that although the pandemic put the focus on the digital environment, child well-being is multifaceted, and it also includes physical and emotional well-being. On a number of measures, modern children's physical and emotional lives have clearly improved thanks to better public safety and support for their health. Rates of accidental injury and death are steadily decreasing, and on average, young people across the OECD are drinking less alcohol, smoking less tobacco, and eating more fruits and vegetables than in past decades. At the same time, children in the 21st century are reporting more stress, more anxiety, including increased pressure to excel in an ever more competitive educational environment. Rates of childhood obesity in OECD countries have been on the rise, and physical activity has actually been decreasing. These trends, of course, have long-term implications. Overweight and obesity are associated with lower educational outcomes, increased cardiovascular disease and diabetes, and even longer-term reduced employment and productivity. In addition to this, since the pandemic began, the situation of many children from disadvantaged backgrounds has worsened. Children in disadvantaged households are less likely to have access to a personal computer or even a quiet space to study. Their parents are less able to help with the schoolwork and efficiently use the resources provided by teachers. Schools play a vital role in addressing material deprivation and providing children with the resources they need to be healthy and thrive. 1 in 10 children, in fact, in European OECD countries experience food poverty. School meals are seen as a way to fight against food insecurity, but this approach was rendered, of course, ineffective by school closures if alternatives were not very quickly put in place. Money is also a barrier to participating in leisure activities for 1 in 3 children in OECD countries. Disadvantaged children tend to do less physical activity and engage more in risky lifestyle behaviors. So let me end by trying to answer the question, what can we do to help? It's clear that the multidimensional nature of child well-being requires breaking down silos and building and reinforcing key partnerships with a range of different actors. Thus also 4 directorates present here from the OECD today. Effective policies include a wide range of actors who work closely with children. Schools working together with other sectors and professionals can be hubs of service provision. Coordinating efforts with actors such as medical practitioners, social workers, law enforcement, digital experts, and more will be key to effective policy development and implementation. Most importantly, maybe, involving children and youth themselves in the solutions is also essential. Especially when talking about digital technologies, children are often the early adopters, so it's even more important to have their voices in the conversation too. I can testify to that from having brought up 3 teenage daughters, and I felt the agony of not always being fully respected and recognized as an early adopter myself. Discussions such as the one we are embarking upon today are an important step in promoting transversal thinking, sparking connections among disciplines, and working to reduce the fragmentation of our policies. I may not be able to stay with you for the whole duration of this meeting. I'll try to listen in on the first couple of interventions, but I do wish you a very productive webinar. This is extremely important, and I look forward to the discussions of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary General. Turning to the main event immediately, please, I'll hand the floor to our moderator, Monica Kaiser, who is a senior counselor in the Directorate of Employment, Labor and Social Affairs. Monica, please.
Thank you so much, MC, and thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General, for your opening remarks, which are setting a great scene for us to pick up on many of the topics that you mentioned. Let me introduce first our panelists in speaking order. So let me start with Andreas Schleicher. Andreas is the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD. Then we have Andrew Wyckoff, who is the Director for Science, Technology and Innovation at the OECD, and the Director of the newly created Center for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity, Romina Boarini. So welcome to everybody, and I look forward to leading you through this discussion in the next 1.5 hours. Let me start with you, Andreas. When we planned the seminar, we were still just coming out of the first wave. The schools had locked down, I believe, in about 190 countries worldwide. And one of the things we thought we had learned, and we saw that in the policies that many countries adopted after this first wave was that it was really important to keep schools open. Now, just in the last couple of days, we've been seeing that many countries had to just basically slam the brakes and started closing schools again, including the country where the OECD is based, including our home country, Germany, Andreas. So could you tell us a little bit more about what we learned in that first wave, which is important for us, for member countries now, to take on board in this second wave?
Thanks so much, Monica. I think the one thing we learned from the first wave is that children are the ones who are least vulnerable to the virus, but they're actually probably the group that has been most affected by the public policy responses to contain this virus. And I think 1.5 billion young people being locked out from their schools. And of course, that has dramatically, as Ulrike said here, dramatically amplified the already many inequalities in our populations and our systems. Now, for young people who knew how to learn, who had access to great technology, a supportive ecosystem around them, parents included, maybe this experience has been liberating and exciting. But for the many children who, were spoon-fed by their teachers, who had, no access to technology, or if they had, who were not able to make sense out of those technologies, I think that's the far bigger barrier than just the technological access, and who had no kind of supportive environment around them. I think this has been devastating. I think that's very clear. No, it's not just the academic side of it, but it's also the many social aspects. There's a loneliness, the mental health stresses. Think about it, 50% of mental health issues of people start at the age of 14. 75% start by the age of 20. This is where things started. And I think we have probably not paid very much attention to this. Schools are often also the very first line of defense. When there are problems at home, this is something what teachers figure out, what teachers bring to the attention of, social welfare. All of that has broken down. I think that's kind of what we learn. And that, I think, is also the reason why in the second, wave, countries have done whatever was possible to keep schools open, and I think that's about getting priorities right. I think it's just a terrible message if we keep, shopping centers and cinemas open and close the schools. I think countries have got that right in the second wave. And I think several things that we can take away. First of all, we have got much better data now that children, and particularly young children, are not super spreaders. I think that there were a lot of fears at the beginning in the first wave, and in the second wave, I think we know better. I think second, many school systems have done very well in, building social distancing protocols into the environment, creating bubbles, creating kind of environments where children can learn safely. I think that's also a big achievement. In a very few months, there's been a lot of not just technological innovation, but also social innovation in education systems to keep schools safe. I think that's a very good achievement. But third, and probably most importantly, I think we all figured out that learning is not primarily a transactional experience, where you broadcast knowledge. It's always a relational, a social experience, particularly for the youngest children. I think that is really what keeps the system together. And what we observed is that the crisis has fundamentally shifted priorities. The well-being of children was always an afterthought. You could read it in a preamble of a school curriculum, but you don't see that in the reality. Actually, when we surveyed, in many countries, that was very, very close to the top of, academic learning. I think it's been raising awareness of this. And I think that's great. And that's also, I think, what we do here with the WISE Center is so important, putting all of those aspects together. This is exactly what you can see mirrored in schools, becoming a kind of more whole of society project. The second part, resilience. Education is no longer just to keep the world in balance, but to help people live in an imbalanced world. I think that kind of concept and term has really sort of made it to the core of curriculum. We move from, protecting children to empowering children, and I think that's very relevant in the digital world. That's relevant in the social world. That's very much the key to sort of helping children to survive and thrive in future crises. And I think, again, it has trickled through. It was before, a word being used, but now you can see that happening a lot in the front line. And then finally, I think we have already heard about it. It's about technology. I think we are just beginning to discover what, artificial intelligence can do to make learning so much more granular, so much more interactive, so much more adaptive. What, big data and learning analytics can do to help teachers understand how students learn differently. That's, for me, the promise of equity that lies in the future. And I think, again, we have seen less reform in the last months, but a lot more change in education and the willingness of people to adopt those kinds of technologies. The one hope I have, though, is that when it comes to children, then we take a bit more care to carefully experiment. What I worry about a bit is that we say, oh, well, let's just try things out. Children will survive this. In the medical sector, we have very rigorous testing protocols. We take, 10 months, even in the middle of the pandemic, to be sure that those kinds of, vaccines are safe. We don't do that very much when it comes to technology exposure to young children. We sort of have this idea, let's just, try that. I do think, that's more rigorous experimentation is something that I'm not so sure I see a lot of this now.
Great, thank you so much, Andreas. I think we'll come back later to also some of the concrete lessons that we have learned in the first wave through the digital, when schools were forced to do it digitally. But we of course all hear your very strong argument for keeping the schools open as much as possible at all, to make sure that all those other benefits of schooling and being together are transmitted. Coming to technology now, Andy. So before the pandemic, we were all, most people were worried about not giving their children too much screen time. And we heard these stories of all these CEOs in Silicon Valley putting their kids in special schools where there were no phones, no mobile phones, no screens, no computers. So now, of course, for parents, the equation has changed a bit, because many parents were actually trying to get their kids online to make sure that they were taking their classes. And at the same time, they were challenged by paying attention that the kids were actually doing the online schooling rather than doing other things, which were maybe less, in the best sense, less educationally valuable, but in the worst sense, they might have actually been dangerous for some of the kids in terms of child protection. And the Deputy Secretary General also mentioned the work that is going on the Council recommendation on child protection online. So can you give us a little bit more of a sense how things have changed through the pandemic in terms of how these risks are being seen, how these uses are being seen, and what maybe new policy challenges are around this for policymakers, but also for parents?
Yeah, thanks, Monica, and thank you, colleagues, for inviting me to this webinar this afternoon. It's extraordinarily complex and interesting topic that's clearly changing pretty quickly, as Andreas has just outlined. And just, as he said, it's a kind of double-edged sword. It has allowed us to keep going, have kids continue to learn, and not only learn from teachers, but from each other and from the social activity that I think that is part of the whole learning environment. But at the same time, has exposed some problems that we've known existed for decades. The digital divide has been with us really from the onset. I think this puts a really sharp light on it and why it's no longer kind of a techie side issue, but now front and center. And I equate it to like adequate housing. I mean, you need to be online now, not only for education, but a whole array of other things. And as you have said, there's a survey, 3,000 parents, that found that almost 2/3 of teens are using social media even more than they did pre-epidemic. And as PISA shows us, already you're at 3 hours a day for many of these kids online. And as is important, and I'm happy to see Romina here, there's a real inequality dimension to this. We know that marginalized children follow marginalized households, and they're less likely to be online than anyone else. By some of our statistics, it's a full 10 to 12 percentage points different if you are from the lowest socioeconomic group versus the average, let alone the highest. And this is troubling, and there's a number of different technological dimensions to this. One is 1 in 5 parents said that their kids probably unlikely to be able to do their homework online because they lack the adequate resources. And that pushes them further behind. Likewise, many kids have to go find public Wi-Fi to connect because they just don't have it at home. Now, some governments have stepped up to this with programs for giving kids equipment, and the Colombia government in particular has even subsidized connections, giving free mobile broadband and voice services up to 1 gigabyte of data to the those that are at lower income levels. But as Andreas rightly suggests, it's not just about connectivity. Access is much more. It's about having the skills and the knowledge, both by the parents and by the kids, to effectively use the technology. And with that comes the risks. Just really quickly, there is exposure to harmful content online, inappropriate contact, and sometimes unknowingly they engage in harmful behaviors. And it's a whole array of harms. I don't really want to go into it. We are developing this typology of risks, accompanying the revision of this council recommendation, which in OECD speak is our soft law. And with that, with the typology, we look at issues of content, conduct, contact, and consumer risk. And we hope to begin to socialize these for comment publicly very soon. And I find the risks, we lack hard evidence here, but what little anecdotal evidence we have coming from Europol suggests a real spike of surge in online distribution of child sexual abuse material. Australia's e-safety commissioner saw a 129% increase between March and September, the lockdown period, of hotline calls reporting online child sexual abuse material. And just this morning in the UK, Ofcom, their regulator, has been given new power to block access to online services that fail to protect children and other users, and will require publication of an audit of efforts to tackle posts that are harmful or illegal. And that's an interesting development, which we will be tracking. Just to end, Monica, as you said, we have this draft recommendation on children in the digital environment, which again will also be open for targeted stakeholder consultation soon. And with that, we're putting a bright light, I think, on some of the issues here, which are quickly evolving. And I look forward to both the panelists, but also the audience to provide input and their ideas on how best we can take this forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. And indeed, these numbers you were just quoting are quite scary. And we know that that's only the tip of the iceberg, because there's so much more going on in the net that people cannot really observe and count and measure. So, and thank you also, and let me support that appeal to the audience to really become involved with us to make sure that we get into this recommendation all the relevant aspects on board. Let me turn to Romina now. Romina, the question of vulnerability and of inequalities has come up a couple of times, and these numbers are, again, indeed dramatic. I mean, what can governments do now to make sure that these children we know are already vulnerable, and we know that vulnerability in childhood is a good predictor for huge problems afterwards in school to work transition, but not only health issues, even that goes all the way through the life course. So in very concrete terms, from what we've learned in the first wave now, and both Andreas and Andy have been mentioning some of these things, what can governments do to make sure that these children do not fall by the wayside, and what support can they give them in very concrete terms, and their parents as well, who often are overwhelmed by the support that their children need?
Yeah, thanks, Monica, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I think it was quite interesting that the speakers so far actually were all very much in agreement with the fact that the impact of the crisis, of course, has been huge on children, especially the policy response. In fact, as Andreas highlighted, but in general, all children's lives have been affected, but indeed, probably the ones that have been affected the most and in the most negative way have been children coming from the most vulnerable households, and what we call in the OECD the vulnerable children. So these are not just the most socioeconomic disadvantaged children, but these are also children that have disabilities, that have mental health issues, children that have been, with child protection systems. And so in general, we actually have emerging evidence that suggests that the pandemic and the lockdown and the various responses to that obviously put those children at higher risk. In general, of course, a lot has been done by governments. Governments have stepped in with very bold actions, but including in terms of extending access to social protection. But when you look at the numbers, what you see is that actually the most vulnerable have not been protected and supported, perhaps as it was necessary. So there was a very interesting study released by UNICEF just a few weeks ago suggesting that there were quite low levels of investment overall. So in rich countries, 47 out of the 159 COVID-related social protections responses were actually specifically designed to support children or families with children. And when you look in particular at the support and the measures that were taken really to help and protect the most vulnerable of those families, you see that very, very few concrete measures have been put in place. For instance, when you look at things such as food support and all the food sort of facilities, the additional ones that have been adopted by countries, in fact, only 7 countries in the OECD decided to put in place such measures. So in general, the issue with the most vulnerable children, and I think we heard a lot around obviously the inputs related to school closure, to home learning, but the impacts of the pandemic are also very much related to the higher family stress that those children in fact had to face. And we know that actually family stress is something that can have a very, very long-term consequences on children's development and well-being. And this is, of course, a big issue for those children in the first place. But we also know that, in fact, financial stress and economic hardship can obviously have a broader societal consequences. What's going on, I mean, what has happened, during the pandemic is that the family stress went hand in hand with other sort of stresses, material deprivation, but also poor family, work-family balance, poor parental mental health and social isolations. And in fact, the COVID has amplified all these problems. And there have been also cases of, increased child maltreatment. The other learning is that financial stress has actually interacted with the quality of parenting and in general with sort of the home environment. And so this is obviously sort of quite worrisome. Now, there's been obviously a reaction by countries in this. And so I don't think it's fair to say that countries were fully blind. In fact, a number of disruption took place when it comes to provisions of family services, and in particular to the services for the most vulnerable households. Nevertheless, there was also very interesting initiative being taken exactly sort of to look into these families and the highest needs of those families. So in fact, what we don't know at the moment is how long countries will be able to support those additional initiatives, and whether in fact within those initiatives there is sufficient screening of the what we call the unmet needs of the children. And so, in fact, in probably, the expectation is that child poverty is going to increase in OECD countries. For instance, in the United States, we estimate that child poverty may increase by more than 1/3 by the end of 2020. And so we obviously need to see to what extent the government is going to put in place a sort of strong response. But so going forward and moving forward, definitely, what we need to have is something that is there to screen the children's needs and make sure that we're able to detect any need for specialist support, and also supporting family services providers in finding new ways of working with families. And so that speaks very much to the fact that the interventions needs to be holistic. And that is why it's very important, I think, to frame all of it through the well-being lens, because as already some speakers said, I mean, when you use the well-being sort of approach, you take into consideration many dimensions of children's lives, but you also, look at the importance of various policies, of course, schools, but of course, mental services and family services more generally speaking. So one of the big issues going forward is really this, try to put in place a coordinated approach. And I think one of the very interesting initiatives that have been, in fact, implemented during the crisis, for instance, was the one taken by Norway that from the very, very first months of the pandemic decided to create this coordinated, centralized support to children. So they really created a very interesting ministerial structure. So it's a mechanism that was exactly tried sort of to achieve this, all of the government support to children. So try to really intervene with the most vulnerable children. Some of the most interesting models, I think, also that we saw, and we would recommend definitely countries to move forward with, relate to what we call so the cascading services. And so the idea with those cascading services is that they actually really tailor to, are better tailored to the most vulnerable families. So they really try to intensify, so focus and intensify the intervention. So, they don't cover necessarily many groups of recipients, many families with children, but they really sort of try to bespoke and address specifically the needs of the most vulnerable. And so those cascading services, these are things that for which I think we start having interesting evidence in the OECD that suggests that those cascading models work very well. So definitely they should be adopted by other countries as well. And we just released a study that says that there are very interesting good practices from where countries can actually learn. So there are still leeway, of course, for improving in terms, for instance, on making sure that there is good feedback that is being given by the recipients, to the family services providers, but also a number of interesting lessons that could be very, very useful for countries in the response to the post-COVID era.
Okay, well, I think maybe we can come back to some of those later. Let me now move to Andreas again. Andreas, on the learning, digital learning, I mean, during the first lockdown, plenty of countries had a lot of experience because they were forced to have that experience, basically. What do you see from looking at what happened, what worked, what didn't work? Have you been able to single out a few elements where you say, if, of course, we understand the first best is to have children physically in school and having interactions, but if that's not possible for whatever reason, are there a few key things that you can already highlight from that first experience? You say, if you do it that way and that way and that way, it's going to work. And there are certain things that you should absolutely not want to do if you want to keep kids learning.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing we have to be quite realistic that in the first wave, most of the technology that was deployed was to conserve existing practice, not to transform it. Now you had teachers giving lessons on Zoom, and that we know is not particularly effective. If you do it, make them shorter and so on. But I think the really good examples are where students are starting to use, virtual laboratories. I think those instruments are now available at scale. As a young person, you don't have to listen to a teacher explaining an experiment. You can do that, and those systems I think work quite well. I think social kind of tools where students sort of start to solve collaborative problem solving tools, game-based kind of approaches. I think, if you can't have the direct social interaction, use technology as much as you can to leverage social interaction. And I've been very encouraged also by the take-up. You have actually large numbers of teachers becoming very, very interested in this. Clearly, countries where you have, and I think it all comes down to what role you take for yourself as a teacher. If you are used to knowledge transmission, you were at a loss in this moment. No? Mm-hmm. If you as a teacher have always seen yourself as a coach, as a mentor, as a facilitator, as an evaluator, You had a great time in this crisis. And actually, that's what we see. For example, you go to education systems like Singapore, like China, teachers had a much easier time because for them, the well-being of students is an integral part of their job. Teaching is just one of many tasks these people are engaging with. It's actually, they teach so much fewer hours than a teacher in the Western world, but they spend so much more time with their students. They do know their students, and then they can deploy technology. So I think, but I do think the kind of social technologies, interactive pedagogies, the tools actually are available. In fact, one of the very, very first things the OECD did is actually compile a resource kit of free available online tools, and we were amazed ourselves how much material is available for use. So I think there are many good examples. I think it's about getting teacher capacity scaled, and I think also it's about learner agency. We need to have more courage to make young people co-creators of innovative learning environments. In fact, that again, in this crisis where you have seen that happening, you've seen so much more progress. I think young people, I think it doesn't address the inequality issue. I think particularly what Romina just highlighted, all of the technology use that we've seen so far is, just amplifying, those first digital divide. But I think at least, we can deploy technology to alleviate the kind of lack of social interaction.
Can I just follow up with one thing, Andreas, on this? Because in the first wave, there was a discussion about what to do with vulnerable students, with people who you already knew were perhaps before COVID were at risk of, they're having bad grades, having difficult backgrounds, not appearing in school regularly. And then there was a debate of whether it would be a good idea to actually focus some measures on these groups, for example, make them go back to school, just like the kids of essential workers. Or, but then there was also debate about whether this is not very discriminatory because you're singling out people in a class and say you're at risk here. We would like you to come back now. So, do you have any advice or experience on what is the best way to deal with that particular inequality?
Actually, bringing students back selectively is, I think, a very, very important tool. And I think wherever it has been deployed, we have seen very good results, where teachers have brought, students at risk back to school. I have not heard any kind of negative reactions of discrimination. I think we have to get away from the notion, there are some students with problems, everyone has some special needs. And I think the role of a great teacher is, what can I do for what students in what situation? I actually think many teachers have lived up to this challenge, but also some things are much simpler. A simple phone call of a teacher to a student can make a huge difference. And we forget that in normal times. When you have 30 students sitting in front of you, you somehow assume they're all present. You assume they're all happy. And in fact, I think what this crisis has shown us that, teachers should probably, spend less time broadcasting your knowledge in a large classroom and spend a lot more time engaging with individual students. And again, some teachers have really lived up to this task in this crisis, connected with students as individuals. And I think that has all been very successful. I'm not at all worried of, differential kind of pedagogies. I'm actually worried that the kind of model of schooling that we have is designed to serve a very narrow kind of path to success. You have to fulfill certain academic criteria to get to Harvard, and that's the only route that we define. We have to become much more courageous to embrace, multiple intelligences and multiple kind of talents, and understand how people learn differently and design learning environments that recognize that, what you learn, where you learn, how you learn, and when you learn can very well differ. And that's, I think, what good teaching is about, to find that out and to support it.
Great, that's a wonderful point, and thank you so much for such an optimistic assessment, Andreas, in a world which is inhabited by a lot of gloom and doom at the moment. And maybe the hope can be that this crisis and the experience with learning, and this different experience with learning, can actually catapult us into the future. Andy, one thing we haven't talked about at all yet is where do you see the different responsibilities? Governments, the private sector, which of course in technology is huge. And then families and parents. But particularly on the private sector, can you give us a little bit of a view on how they've been involved, whether they've been involved in the right way? Should they be doing more? Should they be doing less? And I'm just seeing in the chat, there's a very interesting question here also, which you may have seen, which is about what we think of, what you think, Andy, of marketing to children on social media.
Well,
Which is, of course, one of the things that comes with private sector involvement in online learning and digital use.
yes, let me just start with that. And there are rules and restrictions on marketing to children. The problem then becomes one of identification and monitoring and implementation and enforcement. And this gets much more difficult because a lot of kids don't say their real age online. And so this makes it hard for the platforms to really weed them out. And so it's a bit of, and then if you use more advanced techniques, which they can use, then you get into issues of privacy and quasi-surveillance, which people don't like either. And so it is a tough one to monitor. That said, it is clear, and I spend a lot of time with these platforms these days, that they are aware that they're in a completely new environment in 2020 than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. And this is clear. You can pick up any newspaper any day. And as I said, just the news out of the UK today is another step in this direction. I think the OECD can help here by trying to make things uniform because they are global. And so you don't want kind of a hodgepodge of different standards. This makes it hard for them and reduces some of the good benefits of the internet. But at the same time, you want to put a floor on what is unacceptable behavior. And I think this is slowly beginning to emerge. So that's one step. As you say, they play a huge role in a lot of these things, in roles that you don't even understand or aren't obvious. The amount of cross-Atlantic broadband cables that are now owned by the big tech are growing and are significant already. So they're diversifying into many different areas, which is smart business, but is also indicative of the fact that our regulatory environment isn't always well suited for one firm that's in so many different markets simultaneously, and where they can kind of use multi-sided business models, what we call it, to gain advantage in one market while having a loss leader in another. I do think there's a huge role for them to play, but it is going to have to be a multi-stakeholder environment. I think one of where you need to bring them to the table and understand, because sometimes politicians react reactively and don't understand how difficult it is to implement some of their ideas, which are well intended, but do not always fit perfectly. And I can go into more detail here, but just to say that that's why it's important to have them at the table. But they do need to up their game. Sorry, I'll say that. I think that's clear, and they have to move rather quickly because we've been giving them more of a self-regulatory role for 20 years, and I think people are beginning to see some limits to that, and with that, they should be more proactive themselves.
And picking up on the inequality issue, Andy, with access to technology, could you talk a little bit more about that, in particular with respect to children? Because, I mean, you mentioned before Colombia subsidizing access, because, I mean, we all know it exists. We all know that there's families who are gathering around a smartphone where they're simultaneously trying to do telework for the parents and homework for maybe more than one child. But in very concrete terms, what does that mean? Should these companies be making it cheaper for certain groups? How do you identify the groups, or does that lead to huge market distortions? How can you deal with that type of issue?
So there's, I'll be fast, but I'm happy to come back to it. This is something that preoccupies us a lot. So there are a number of provisions going back to the telephone about universal service requirements and the universal fund. When you pay your phone bill, a certain percentage of it goes in to fund that build out and to put a network throughout the whole country. It's places that wouldn't be economically logical to put the network far into rural areas and so forth. So that there are provisions that have been used. Modern day provisions tend to be more about clever uses of spectrum auctions, because so much of this is wireless now. And so it's not necessarily the most money that you can gain from a spectrum auction, but maybe the most coverage. And then if you'll hear this from the OECD, we like competition to drive down prices. Some of the cheapest prices in the world now for data are in India. And that is because they have a very active environment with a disruptive entrant who is forcing prices low. And likewise, we enjoy low prices in France compared to a lot of the rest of the OECD. And again, it's the regulatory environment, which I think can help set it. Now, getting directly to schools is a different issue. And there have been initiatives, I'm aware of one of them led by the UN, GIGA, I think, project, which is to connect every school with broadband. And that's more probably a public effort to encourage the private sector and work with them to make that happen.
Thank you. Romina, you stressed the important holistic nature of dealing with inequalities according to COVID. Now that we know there's a lot of inequalities. It's not only children, it's gender inequalities, it's regional inequalities. Right after us, there will be an event for those who are interested on indigenous communities and if in the COVID times. How do you recommend that governments work on reconciling all these different inequalities, and how do you think one can work to keep a focus on children, which often do not have that as much strong lobby compared to other inequalities? And then connected to that, also we've been having a little bit of a debate, which I found very interesting, is that health has been equated with a focus on well-being, because people have been saying governments have been focusing on health and more than the economy. So it's been putting people first, but when they said putting people first, it's been mostly, well, they've been dealing with health issues first. And that was, but that's of course much wider. So can you maybe give us a little bit of your insights on the wider well-being perspective and say, how governments can, are there any government strategies which are particularly useful to reconcile all of these different aspects and make sure that you worry about those first who are the most vulnerable?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think on the first question, indeed, I mean, inequalities are many and very often they compound. That said, I would say that very often, you don't necessarily have a lot of trade-offs when you want to deal with this different types of inequalities, because very often you have groups that are the ones in a way that concentrate the most source of disadvantage. So you may have families that live sort of in the most disconnected sort of territories or communities, and very often these are also the families where let's say people are less, the parents are less active in the labor market, or women may be sort of just actively sort of working, etc. So I'm not sure, that the fact that there are so many different types of inequalities means that it's impossible to come with just sort of one integrated approach. And if you look at the perspective of the family providers, what they do, I mean, family services providers, what they do is that they really sort of try to sort of be connected with their clients as much as possible. And so they try to understand sort of the different sources, I would say, of disadvantage. And so, it's not that they are only acting obviously on sort of social support or mental health, but they really also try to connect with those families and those individuals with labor markets as well. But I think what you were saying about, I mean, it's quite interesting, for instance, what we learned during the crisis around the fact that some women, or what some women have been, or women in general have been hit, I would say, the hardest because during the pandemic and during the crisis, because that they happen to be working in those sectors that have been disrupted the most following the lockdowns. And there is interesting evidence that this also has an impact on children, and the most sort of vulnerable children, because when women started to be also disconnected from labor markets and started to be social isolated. This is actually increases their financial stress, their feelings of economic insecurity, and we know that this can actually trickle down to children. So again, the actions, I would say, is not just one, but this is really sort of a multiple, one that really takes into account the different needs of the different families. I talk about the cascading services, but maybe I now can stress as well the type of new forms of mental health well, some countries already have started putting in place. In fact, I think that connects very well to this topic, the topic of this session, because some of those new mental health services in Canada, for instance, they were, set in motion thanks to the new technologies. And so I think that's really speaking to the potential and to the, in fact, many opportunities that digital technologies sort of open. And so it's interesting to see that when those mental health services sort of are created, they can, in principle, reach out also to the most vulnerable families, provided that, of course, some basic digital sort of digital divides are bridged, but those services are interesting because they sometimes actually can overcome the issue of stigma and discrimination, because of course they are anonymous and etc. So just to say that there are interesting, I think, learnings from what we're seeing in countries, and in a way the pandemic was not just, it was a disruptor, but also forced, I think, countries to innovate in interesting manners. On the second questions around, you're right, around, sort of, has there been one country in a way that's put in place just, a very, very integrated well-being approach to sort of respond to the pandemic? I would say we have one experience that is an interesting one, and this is the one by New Zealand. And we heard yesterday during the commemoration of the OECD 60th anniversary about that experience. And of course, the New Zealand made a very, very strong choice, putting sort of the lives of people first. And the New Zealand itself sort of highlighted that was really was about really prioritizing people's well-being, not just from a health or a physical health perspective, because in fact, what New Zealand also did was looking at, for instance, the mental health implications or the social connections implications of lockdowns. And so in that sense, this is an interesting experience, because in other countries, perhaps those implications for mental health were not necessarily put, I would say, to the core of the policy considerations.
Romina, let me jump in here right there, because we have a question in the chat, which is very much connected to this question, and I would like to give that to Andreas actually, and I'll read out the question. And this is, what is your idea about the effect of virtual education on evolution of more introvert personality people in the community in the next generation, people who have less skills and less interpersonal skills? And how can the system help them deal with this? And specifically, how can you get more inclusion for shy or initially introvert children? Andreas, do you have any advice for Sarah Farmani?
Well, I think it's a good question. And actually, I think we have to be cognizant that for some children, actually, it's easier to interact with technology than to interact in the kind of interpersonal environment. And again, I think that's how technology can help. But also, I think as a good educator, you will try to sort of bridge that. And I think the biggest risk is that the technology just reinforces our own learning preferences, our own learning styles. It connects us with people who think like us, who work like us, who look like us. And I do think the education experience should be to help people look outwards and to look towards a variety of learning styles. And again, I think the social interaction in the classroom helps students to understand that there are different ways of learning. And so on the one hand, I would say, yeah, technology will facilitate exactly that. If you are a shy and introvert person, actually, technology can do a lot for you directly. But I think it should not be the end of the learning and education process, really.
Great. Then it's connected to that is, of course, the question of bullying, cyberbullying versus real bullying. Do we have any indication on that, Romina, yet?
We have actually, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well, both of you.
No, very quickly. I think, of course, we do have some evidence, but I think it's fair to say that I think Andrew was stating this, that this is an area in general field where more solid evidence, I think, needs to still be collected. And I think it was interesting, for instance, there was a survey being run on almost 30,000 young people under 19 from all countries of the world. And that was a survey that was actually run just in the very first few months of the pandemic, and the answers that were found in that survey were actually saying that some kids were pretty happy staying home because that that actually protected them from bullying happening in schools. And so cyberbullying, of course, doesn't necessarily respond to that, but we also know that schools can actually not necessarily always be safe for some children. So I think this is an area where more evidence definitely is needed. But Andreas.
Okay. Andreas, you also wanted to say something to that. Why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I think that is true. I think, but you also have the reverse, for children, bullying in school ends when schooling ends, and cyberbullying is a 24/24 kind of experience. And I think, but what's interesting is when we compare, the long-term evolution, we have not seen an increase in cyberbullying despite the rapid increase in technology consumption. And I also want to say that actually there are a lot of really good anti-bullying approaches now available. I think this is something that, there's always a question, do you address those things through consumer protection or through enabling strategies and empowering strategies? And I think we have very good experience on the latter, that actually you can do a lot to combat bullying and cyberbullying with good kind of approaches. And, I just think the consumer protection angle has its limits. I think with knowledge products, we just don't have many good kind of approaches there. But I think we can do a lot to help young people and to sort of become more resilient to those kinds of approaches. But it is a challenge, I think that's what technology will do to people, and it will give, it just amplifies good practice and good ideas in the same way it amplifies bad practice and bad ideas now.
And it definitely isn't limited to children. Andy, there's a question in the chat here, which you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it. It's from Oyigoga Onu. What strategies are recommended for safeguarding the health of students due to increased exposure to emissions from electronic gadgets? So that's an interesting question. And I guess with rollout of 5G, that's a question also that some people are asking. So give us some of your scientific evidence on that, Andy.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not going to be the best person to answer that. I look at the various studies intermittently. This is more of a WHO or a true health issue but my reading of them, Monica, is that so far it has been, people have been unable to find a direct link between the emissions and any adverse health outcome. That's my reading of it. Now that those are direct health things, but what we're talking about today is the indirect. I mean, it's about the cyberbullying, it's the addiction, it is the sexual activity going on online for underage people. We have a whole line of work on terrorist and violent and extreme content, which is another evil on the content side of the internet. So to me, that's what gets my attention first, and less so the others. But not to say that it couldn't possibly exist. I just haven't seen the hard-headed scientific analysis of this. Bear in mind, my parents in the 60s and 70s kept me away from the color TV set. And to some extent, cathode ray tubes, you didn't want to be behind one necessarily, and so forth and so on. So I'm saying that some of these risks are bad, but then there are risks in life. Every time you get in that automobile, you're taking a certain risk. So I guess I'm just saying, I don't think you're ever going to get anything that's exactly risk-free, but hopefully we can minimize them. And again, I don't mean to downplay it, but.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's go to a few more questions in the chat. here is one that is from somebody who is talking about his school. Our school has offered parents and students the option of either coming physically to school or else following online from home due to personal matters. One of the biggest challenges we are facing as educators is assessing summative exams which are reliable. Respect equity and produce a fair outcome. Any ideas? This is to all of you. How to ensure reliable exams under these conditions, particularly when half of the kids are home and the other half are in school? Anybody want to try and answer on that one?
Yeah, you know, Monica, I think one of the problems that we have in education that, you know, over the last few hundred years, we have divorced assessment and learning. And I think I think this crisis reminds us that that is, you know, where the fundamental problem arises. I think the future is with integrating assessment and learning. You know, wherever you learn, you know, computers are capable to actually help you figure out very quickly what you're doing well and where you struggle. And I think to close those feedback loops, and I think data is terribly important. You know, that's what I really worry, that in this crisis, we have just given up the metrics that we have and have put nothing in place instead. So that's why so many young people are now falling off the radar screen of any kind of intervention. But, you know, I also think that this crisis reminds us that we should, you know, get away from these kinds of very lumpy end of course, summative kind of metrics towards a much more, you know, when you play a computer game, you know, why do people like it? Actually, because they're permanently assessed. People do like that kind of feedback and appraisal. And I think we should just, you know, make that a more regular experience of the learning experience, whether in school and at home. The one comment I want to make, you know, many schools have done what this principal is saying, you know, giving parents more choice. I actually worry about it because I think that is what reinforces the inequalities in education. Now, those kids who probably need that experience most will not, you know, opt for it if they have their choice. Chile is a good example. You know, they couldn't get agreement on the reopening of schools, so they made it voluntary for families and for schools. And this is already, you know, one of the most inequitable school systems. So you can imagine what happened in this. I think we have to be, irrespective of this point of assessment, be really careful to use good judgment on where we use presential learning and where we rely on remote learning.
Andy, I saw you nodding. Is there anything that you would like to add to this? You're muted.
Sorry. No, it's a pleasure. I just agree with the good insights of Andreas. He and I spent a fair amount of time talking about big data and AI, maybe from different perspectives, but and there's certainly reasons to be careful of this, particularly the privacy dimension, but it can give you insights that we just haven't had before to a lot of, you know, just look what DeepMind did last week on protein folding for viruses. This is a big step in science that I don't think it would have taken scientists a very, very long time, if ever, to come up with that solution. And I gotta believe there's some more applications in the areas of how we learn. And as Andreas has said, we're all so different that how we learn is through very different, and to be able to tap into some of that, I think, is great promise. But Monica, we've talked about this too. You need to put some safeguards around it, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put some guardrails on the road of AI and other work we're doing at the OECD, but I won't get into that now.
Good. Okay, so we have another question from Maria Luisa. This is for Romina. Are there any effective evidence-based programs focused on increasing psychological well-being and resilience in the school context, or also for Andreas, i.e. from early childhood education to tertiary education? So I think that this is a group we haven't really talked about much yet, the students. So you want to start on early education, Romina, and then maybe move up to students, I don't know, Andreas, wherever.
Sure. Yes, I think we do have some interesting examples of programs that work really well for very young kids and also for older kids. And I think what those programs tell us is that, well, first of all, they try to really, again, frame all the issues through this multi-faceted sort of perspective and really try to understand sort of the the physical, the cognitive, and so the psychological components of children's well-being. They try to understand that is, of course, the development of children is something that is dynamic. It changes very much with the age of the kid. And very interestingly, I think one of the things that those programs try to accomplish is this link with the parenting, capabilities. And so, how they, those programs are not just, focusing obviously on the child as main recipient, but they are trying to understand sort of how, the child is evolving, within the broader sort of a home environment. And so they try to do something around having the parents engaging and with the broader development of the child, and obviously, the most interesting programs, I mean, from an equity point of view, are the ones that take into account the fact that the resources of some types of households may be limited, and therefore the whole idea is to how to unlock those additional sort of resources, and those mental health programs that work very well, really try to take into consideration the different aspects of families, including the financial stress, including also the elements related to housing, for instance, which is, one of the other, for instance, quite interesting fact that emerged during the COVID. Obviously, the physical space. I mean, and the quality of that space is crucial, also from not just from a learning point of view, but also from a mental health viewpoint.
Andreas, anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, we have only pre-COVID data on this, but when it comes to technology, our data show that once you get beyond 5-6 hours of screen exposure, and actually don't, laugh about it, this is a fair number of students for whom this is the case, you see very clearly negative effect in terms of well-being, a lack of friends, lack of social interactions. I feel sad. I feel, a lot of the causal nature is very hard to underpin, but I think high technology intensity clearly is one of the predictors of those kinds of negative feelings. The other part, what is quite interesting, when you survey teachers of younger children in pre-primary education, they usually are far more sensitive to well-being needs of children than children in lower secondary and high school, according to our TALIS data. And I think that's something, in the early years, we sort of put a priority on this and we lose that somehow. And I think that's why that doesn't say anything about effectiveness, but I do think we have to pay much more attention to those dimensions in the later school years now.
Andy, anything you want to add on that? No?
No,
Okay.
Picking up on the chat, just 1 second, Monica, where there's an interesting line in there about locking away your smartphone when you're at school in a phone away box, which I'm not familiar with, but I think that it's, as someone who has been working with computers since the late 70s and who's been following it, I think it's not the worst idea I've heard of. And as a parent of 3, like Ulrich, I took the device away. I killed the Wi-Fi in our household with children growing up. I think it's something maybe we should begin to consider, not a 24-hour ban, but just limits, and particularly at school. But again, Andreas is the educator. I'm not. I'm just looking at the what I think is an interesting idea.
Well, actually, there is evidence just having the phone lying around diminishes attention. Is not even, but I think it's a question of balance. I think it's a question of, finding the right mix of what learning method is most suitable in what moment. And I think either extreme, I think is, what worries me most is that we just do very little inquiry and research about this. We have very strong beliefs and ideas about those things. Is technology good or bad? But we do very little to actually find out. And I think this is where the kind of medical sector is so much more advanced. When we have new methods, new ideas, we test them out. We look at their effects. We study their consequences. And you don't see very much of this in education. I think a lot of the, we focus on one thing today, the digital learning. There are many other ways of, using technology. And actually in the COVID pandemic, when we talk about equity, we have seen, television and radio playing hugely important roles in countries like Spain or, Brazil. And we just, lock our thinking into one dimension. And I think we have to be a much more kind of open to, different means of learning, and then, doing better scientific study on what are the effects.
And I think, Andreas, if I might add to that, what's also really important is that we understand better what exactly kids are doing this. I would say that having observed this as a mother during the pandemic, during the lockdown, thank God for social media, because I saw my daughter communicating with her friends around the world on screen, on FaceTime, which was for kids being locked home alone. An enormous relief that you could talk to people, that they were available, that you didn't feel left out. I mean, if you compare that to our childhood, where all we had was a family phone where people were lining up, that nobody stayed on the phone too long. I think those are also things that we really need to see the positive sides on. Let me now move to a few more questions in the chat, because I think we should do justice to our audience, which I feel, just looking at the questions that are being asked, include a lot of teachers. So let's move a little bit to the question here. For example, there's one from Maria Joao. Concerning the issues that are being discussed, in particular the well-being of children, are teachers prepared to cope with these problems? What initiatives can help them do it, like in-service teachers education? Andreas, this is probably for you, because you're the one who knows most about teachers, but of course the others should also feel welcome to step in.
Yeah, I'm worried that we turn often to the same kind of bad solutions with teachers that we do for students. Okay, there's some problem, and so we put people through more training. I actually think, school needs to become more of a place where everybody learns, where, students learn, teachers learn, parents learn. And I think we need to make schools better learning environments for teachers. We should give teachers more time to do other things than teaching. The education research shouldn't be done in some university. It should be done by practitioners, like we have in other sectors. And I think the moment we make teachers part of the solution, same for technology. I don't think the solution lies in, having companies selling technologies to schools. I think the solution lies in actually, educators becoming designers and working with technology companies to build the learning systems of the future. These are the people of experts. So I think this kind of in-service and pre-service training can be a small part of the solution, but I don't think it addresses the big gap that we have between what's needed and what's available. At this point, it's not about, adding a few more training courses on technology. It's about, fundamentally rethinking, pedagogical practices, reconfiguring the space, the people, the technology, the time to achieve something totally different. And I think you need to make teachers really an integral part of the design of those solutions. And that is not happening in many places, unfortunately.
Isn't that going to take a long time, Andreas? And are there any countries that are like gold standards in that? Because now we're talking about emergency, right? We're scared about every day that we're leaving certain kids behind. But it sounds great what you're saying, but isn't that going to take forever?
But precisely, I think in this crisis, we see so much more change than with the old traditional approaches. I think it is the traditional teacher training that has not delivered. In this crisis, you have lots of teachers who take initiatives, who need more support, a more enabling environment, maybe more resources. I actually think this crisis is the perfect illustration that it takes a change in the work organization and incentive structures to get people, mobilized and share ideas. We spend so much time to push new practice and sometimes old practice into schools. We take so little time to find the good ideas and, scale and spread them. And I actually really believe that that's where this crisis has made a real difference. What I hope, that you have lots of teachers going back to their school leaders after this and say, well, I have actually learned to become a really good designer of technology-based learning environment. I don't want to go back to teach the kind of prefabricated curriculum. And I hope you're going to have many young people who go back to their teachers and said, I've actually learned to learn on my own. I know how to use technology. Why don't we have to listen to sort of one structure for all? I just think, this crisis is for me the illustration that it's not about, doing more of the old same, but it's about, creating a more dynamic and enabling environment. That's where the
Just-
education sector has really this very industrial work culture that we have in education. That is the problem.
But then, Andreas, isn't the question how to get the ministries of education to listen to those experiences? Any insights from anybody on how you can escalate this up to the place where they make decisions on curricula and so on? Because if it were up to teachers and students alone, I'm sure that, and even parents, I'm sure there would be plenty of good ideas, but then how do you get the rules and regulations adapted quickly?
If I just may add to this, if you actually look to the education systems that have worked most successfully through this crisis, it's not that the government stands back and let a thousand flowers bloom. Is that the governments become really great knowledge mobilizer. They actually, work actively to, get ideas floating around the system. They actually create a space for incubators. They actually, make good learning visible. And, they create, platforms with reputational metrics so that, good ideas get traction. I think it's not about, government retreating from this. It's just changing the role to become, a good regulator, a good enabler, rather than, managing a kind of factory where you have exchangeable widgets on an assembly line. I really think, and you look to Estonia, you look to Finland, they have, made that transition 15 years ago. And why do they get so well through this crisis? Because they have so many people at the front line who know how to take initiative and who know how to talk to their colleagues and who know how to reach out to if you are, in Finland, a school leader, you spend 3/4 of your time managing your school, and you'd spend 1/4 of your time working in the local municipality designing school policy. You're not, listening to a bureaucrat. You are the education system. And that's where you talk with your colleagues about, your experience with COVID in mind and how we can learn from each other. That's the social fabric, I think, that will make our education systems far more dynamic and fast-paced in responding than the very kind of hierarchical structure. Now, if you believe that you can change things through teacher training, you think about 20 years' time. That's what it takes to actually get in a new idea, translated into new practice at scale.
Andy, Romina, any comments on that? Any additions?
I would just add, I leave the education and schooling up to Andreas, but I am, as someone who's been watching the digital transformation for some time, I know that some of these service, particularly those that are in the public sector, are less amenable to change than others. But just look what's happened to healthcare and how much of that has gone online with new practices and so forth, how quickly you can get testing. The anti-COVID app that I have on my phone from the French government, that's a sector that wasn't prone to much change that has seen, I think, a lot of change. Likewise, I point to finance, again, a very mature sector, but just look at the shift away from traditional currency to e-payment in a very short, it was already going on, but we've seen a step change through the crisis.
Romina, did you want to add anything to this?
Well, I mean, the only sort of additional thought, just to join sort of Andreas, call for creating platforms where not only this is about sort of co-creating what the different stakeholders of the education system, but also to be probably closer to what students needs and wants. And I think I'm not exactly sure about what happened in those countries that Andreas was talking about, but when you have those education systems, I would say are very, innovating and very adaptable. Probably they are also connecting very much with the students, and so they can take, for instance, insights from what's going on, from students directly. And again, I want to quote the example from Norway, because there was a very interesting one where you had, again, all different parts of the government stepping together and also engaging a lot with the students, and different associations of students. And the result of that actually was that the schools reopened in Norway, because, that's very important feedback from, the students and the ones that, revolve around students was given to the government.
Great, thanks, Romina. There's another question from Colin from Dunblane, Scotland. He says, I wondered about, what the panel thought about soft skills such as leadership, social skills, etc. And we know that the OECD has been saying this for a very long time, that this is what we're going to need much more of in the future of work. And how can digital learning help young people learn, develop, and refine those? As these soft skills are constantly looked at directly or indirectly in school time, but difficult to get across when pupils are learning from home. Is that the case, or can you also train or learn or promote soft skills when in digital learning? That's Colin's question.
I would say yes. In fact, many people don't like homework. Actually, I think homework is a great tool to actually develop soft skills. That's where you learn to, resist or reinvent or, persist in difficulties. And the same for remote learning. I think if learner agency is what you want to encourage, independent learning, home learning is a great tool. I also believe, creative thinking, critical thinking is what you need to learn to use technology, but also that you learn with technology. One of the most devastating figures when it comes to, technology is from our latest PISA round that, you have just 9% of 15-year-olds who can distinguish reliably between fact and opinion when the context gets fairly complex. But
9%.
9%, it's not a minority. It's basically, it's not a small number. It's basically a very small share of young people who actually can navigate ambiguity. And I think that's what you learn in this kinds of environment. Social skills, you need to connect, collaborate with people. I do think we could use technology much more intensively to foster those 21st century skills, leadership, courage, creativity, imagination. And I think some of them you develop in a personal context, absolutely. But I do think technology opens up a lot of avenues that we do not see in very traditional learning environments in school.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? No, but then let me follow up with a question on that, which I'm sure Romina will also be interested in. So precisely for those soft skills and for this creativity and self-directed learning and so on, works well for some kids, very well, because they're motivated, because they're intrinsically motivated, perhaps, or maybe they just have this feeling that they're going to do this because it's school. There are others where even in a presence context, it's harder. And how do you, we've all been seeing during the first wave, all those numbers about what they call the décrocheurs in France, which are the ones you lose on the way and who have basically dropped off the radar completely. Now, isn't there, how are we going to get those people not only back, but also into soft skills? How do you do that online?
I'm in two minds about it. I think actually part of the issue is lack of relevance. I don't think we lose so many people because they lack the skills. It's because we lose many people because the way of learning that we value in schooling is not relevant to them. You can see, for example, countries that have a broader balance between academic and vocational pathways don't have that kind of problem of dropout because students can just find multiple pathways. I think we just, as a teacher, as a good teacher, you find out how different students learn differently and you embrace that diversity with differentiated practice. If you have a student, for whom that personal contact is very important, focus your energy on this. If you have other students who are very good at learning on their own, give them the space for this. I think that's what we really need rather than channeling students through just one pipeline. And I do think, yeah, absolutely. You will find students who will, drop out. But I think most of the dropout happens because the lack of relevance. Students just do not understand, why do I have to learn this, trigonometry when, the world is burning? Sort of, that's, I think, what we should, think harder about. What do we teach to whom and what way? And I'm not an advocate, of letting students choose all of that, because I think you just need to learn a lot of tools that are hard to study. But I think the mode of learning, we should become much more flexible, and teachers, I think, should, focus their energy and time on those who need the most. Now, I think if you come from a wealthy background, you're going to have lots of open doors in your life. You don't need to worry very much about schooling. If you come from a disadvantaged background, you have one single card to play, and that is a great teacher and a great school. And I think so. I think if teachers take that to heart, I think we would see not only better learning outcomes, we see a lot more equitable learning outcomes.
Thanks, Andreas. That's a really encouraging message, I think, for all of the teachers that we're having online now. Now we have 4 minutes left to close. I would like to ask all of you, this being the OECD, to respond to one question in the chat in just 2 sentences. And that is, it says here, it's very inspiring what happens in Finland, but we need change of attitude to allow innovation and creativity in community settings. How can country leaders become more sensitive to these issues? So, and I'm turning this question into what can we at the OECD do to convince country leaders on this? So 1 minute each. Who wants to go first? Andy.
Okay, fine. Two things. One, I think you need to broaden the people you talk to, and especially to the youth on any issue dealing with the digital transformation. They have different perspectives and different skills. The other thing is that you need to bring in the techies. You need to have people who are technically competent in your government advising you. Otherwise, you're flying blind on some of this stuff.
Great. Romina?
Well, I would definitely say that the returns are huge, and returns from this very, very innovative type of thinking and important investment in all children, but also in those sort of important questions around the input of the digital technology. These are so important, and there are immense opportunities, and so it's really key for countries to well understand, what are the inputs that we see, but again, how those, risks that definitely are concentrated perhaps on some groups of the population, how those risks can be turned into opportunities for all.
Thank you. And Andreas, last word?
Yeah, I think actually it's very simple. Take more time to listen to students, take more time to listen to teachers, take more time to listen to parents. I think many of and give people who have good ideas a space to expose them, and I'm not talking about, performance related pay and these things. I'm talking simply about, recognizing the good work that is done in the front line and, exposing that.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to the whole excellent panel. I hope that our audience has enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. And I hand back to our MC for perhaps a very last word. Tracy?
There's really nothing for me to say, just only to thank everyone again in the panel, our audience on Facebook and on Zoom, who've been very, very active, and lots of great questions. The stream will be live, and you can access it afterwards on Facebook if you'd like to see it or if you'd like to share it. And thank you also, Monica, for your wonderful chairing. It's been a pleasure and really nice to see this conversation among so many different perspectives of what is a really, really important topic that we need to get right, basically. So thank you all.
Bye.